Hi, my name is Rick Markin, and I'm here to talk to you today about perceptual control theory. And first, I would like to thank Boba for inviting me to speak at the conference, and I'd also like to apologize for being unable to be there in person. Believe me, I would really have liked to be. The title of my talk is Are We Controlled or in Control? This is the title of our book on PCT that, as it's translated into Slovenian and Croatian, the English title of the book is Controlling People. And in English, that's a double entendre. It has two meanings at the same time. One of the meanings is that it refers to people who are controlling, that is, people who control other people. Perhaps you know such people who are very interested in getting other people to do what they want them to do. The other meaning is the process of controlling other people. Controlling people refers to the process of controlling other people. These two meanings apparently could not be captured in translation, but the current translation does capture the fact that our book deals with perceptual control theory in terms of issues relating to the control of human behavior. In particular, whether or not people can be controlled or not. Actually, the issue of whether or not human behavior could be controlled is what originally got me involved in perceptual control theory. In the late 1970s, B.F. Skinner was arguing that human behavior can be controlled because it is inherently controllable. But when I got into perceptual control theory, I learned from the developer, Bill Powers, that in order for humans to be controlled, they not only have to be controllable, they have to be able to be controllers. They have to be able to be in control because it's people like Skinner who would be doing the controlling. So control of behavior is only possible if people are controllable and can be controlled because of that. But it's also only possible if people can be in control and be the controllers controlling other people. But this seems paradoxical. How can people be both controlled, that is, have themselves be controllable, and in control, or able to control at the same time? This paradox is illustrated by the cover art on our English edition of the book, where you see a fellow being controlled by a lady up at the top of the picture, and also controlling somebody else who's off the picture at the bottom. This illustrates the paradox of controlling other people, because when you see the fellow in the picture being controlled by the strings of the manipulated by the lady in the picture, then that seems inconsistent with the idea that he can also be controlling somebody else, that he can be able to control another person's behavior. But the idea that he can control another person's behavior is also inconsistent with the idea that he's being controlled. So that's the paradox right there. In that picture, you can't see that man there as both a controller and able to manipulate another person, and at the same time manipulatable by somebody else. We call this the paradox of controlling people. That's why we gave the title Controlling People to our book. And the paradox is solved by perceptual control theory. Perceptual control theory shows how it is possible for people to be in control and at the same time controlled. Indeed, perceptual control theory shows that we can be controlled most easily when we are most in control. So in order to understand this, the PCT solution to this paradox, the first thing we have to do is take a close look at what control is. So what do we mean when we say that a person controls or is being controlled? What is control? Control is an observable phenomenon that you can see happening in front of you. Technically, it's the process of producing pre-selected results in a disturbance-prone world. This means that it's actually, that's just a fancy way of saying that control is the process of carrying out a purpose, achieving a goal, but doing it in the context of a world that's often changing, so that the way you achieve that goal is often has to be different each time. So control is happening whenever you see a person producing some result on purpose and doing it in the context of constantly and often invisibly changing circumstances or disturbances. I think this will become more tangible when we look at a particular example of control. Almost any behavior that people do could serve as an example of control. I've picked an example of taking a sip of tea. And in order to see that control is involved in this simple behavior, apparently simple behavior, we have to look at that behavior in terms of the components of control that are involved. These components are the controlled variable, the reference state of that variable, and the disturbances to the controlled variable, and the outputs that keep the variable at its reference. And I am using symbols to describe each of these variables. So here we have a picture of a lady taking a sip of tea. The controlled variable, or one of the controlled variables involved in this, is the position of the cup. What has to happen when you take a sip of tea is you have to lift the cup to your lips. And so the position of the cup has to be changed from on the table to up at your lips. So that variable, the position of the cup, has to be controlled. And the reference state of that variable is at your lips. You want to bring the cup to your lips, and you do that by using lifting forces, your muscle forces, to lift the cup to your lips. But there is a disturbance involved in this process that actually is a little hard to notice. And the disturbance is gravity. It's a disturbance, and it's a variable, because the effect of gravity on the cup is changing each time you take a sip. And it's changing because the amount of tea in the cup is changing each time you take a sip. So the cup is slightly lighter each time you lift it to your lips. That means that you can't use the same muscle forces each time in order to lift the cup to your lips. Indeed, the forces you use to lift the cup to your lips have to be precisely countering the force of gravity that's acting on the cup at the time. If you don't use exactly the right muscle forces to lift the cup each time, you will either not get it up off the table at all, or you'll lift it so quickly that it'll pass your lips and fly onto the person sitting behind you. So, but in fact, what happens when people sip tea is that they consistently bring the cup precisely to their lips and take a sip each time. The fact that they're able to consistently do this, to consistently bring the controlled variable, the position of the cup, to the reference state at the lips is actually an achievement. It's not just something that happens. It's not a behavior that pops out of people. It's a controlled result. The sip, the getting the cup to your lips to take the sip, is a controlled result of muscle forces. So when you're looking at this apparently simple behavior, you are looking at control happening. You are looking at a person controlling the position of the cup incredibly precisely. Perceptual control theory was developed by William T. Powers to explain what we saw in the previous slide, to explain the fact that people control. Perceptual control theory, as its name implies, is a theory of control, of how people control. Actually, control theory, as an engineering discipline, has been applied in psychology since World War II, at least. Engineering control theory was developed in the 1920s, and it was started to be applied in psychology in a field called human factors engineering in the 1940s. But when it was first applied in psychology, it was used to explain behavior the way psychologists thought it worked. Psychologists thought behavior was a stimulus response process, and control theory was used to explain how stimuli cause responses, and it can be used that way. But it turns out that was the incorrect way to use it, because behavior is not a stimulus response process. And perceptual control theory is the correct application of control theory to behavior. Powers was able to do this. Powers was able to correctly apply control theory to behavior because he was not only a control engineer, so he understood control theory, but he was also a physicist. So he understood what we just learned from the previous slide. He understood that behavior couldn't possibly be a process of or something that just popped out of people. It wasn't just an output. Behavior had to involve control because there were these pesky disturbances always influencing what we did. People couldn't consistently walk, talk, and do all the things that they do that we see as behavior unless they were controlling the things that we see as behavior, unless the walking was a controlled result of action, unless talking is a controlled result of action. We couldn't produce consistent results unless behavior was control. So Powers' incredible insight and contribution to our understanding of human nature is that he understood that behavior is a process of control, and therefore the only way to explain it is in terms of control theory, a theory of control. Here's the basic PCT model of behavior. What you see here is, first of all, the phenomenon to be explained, the controlling that we see out here in the environment. So the environment has the controlled variable QI, which was in our example the position of the cup. It has the outputs, the muscle forces that lift the cup, the QO, and it has the disturbances affecting the position of the cup, gravity affecting it. So out here in the environment, controlling is happening. Up above it, the system is the actual theory. This is the explanation of why the cup consistently gets to the lips. And the explanation is that, first of all, you perceive the position of the cup. So that's the input function is your sensor systems that produce a perception in you of the perception or of the position of the teacup. That's P, the perception. That perception is compared to a neural signal called a reference signal, R in here. This is your goal for the position, for that perception, the goal for the position of the cup. And those two variables go into this comparator and are compared by subtraction. The comparator tells the difference between the reference signal, where what is wanted of the cup, of the perception, and it compares that to the perception itself. And the difference is it comes out as an error signal. Error is the difference between the reference and the perception. Error drives the output of the system, the output being the muscle forces that are produced. So the bigger the error, the more push you put on the cup, and that goes out into the world, and via what's called the feedback function, your outputs affect the cup, and at the same time as the disturbance is affecting the cup. So there is a closed loop of cause and effect here in this model, and I've described this, and you have to describe it, as a sequence of events. But actually, everything is happening in this loop at the same time, so that the perception is being controlled, is being compared to the reference at the same time as the output is affecting the controlled variable and thus the perception. So all this is happening at the same time, and the net result is that the system is generating outputs that are exactly compensating for the disturbance and thus keeping the perception or moving the perception of the controlled variable to the reference and keeping it there if for as long as you want to take a sip. So the way to visualize, I guess, what's happening with this control system is that it is continuously acting to keep the perception of the controlled variable, P, matching the reference signal, bringing it to the reference signal, so that, and it does that by producing just the right error signals and just the right outputs that compensate for any effect of the disturbance that creates any error, and the error compensates for the disturbance and keeps that perception right on R. So the net result of this, is that the perception is kept essentially equal to the reference. There's very little error that exists in a control system when it's operating properly. That's an important thing to understand. In order to really understand the perceptual control theory model, how it works, you really have to understand the mathematics of control, and it also helps if you can go through the working models of the control process that are available on the net. But in our book, Controlling People, we tried to give only a verbal, qualitative understanding of control, and so which I think is certainly sufficient for people who are not professional researchers. So the qualitative way of looking at the control process is that it is a closed loop negative feedback process. The closed loop acts, that is, it produces outputs, QO, that consistently bring a perceptual representation, P, a perception of a variable aspect of the environment, such as the position of a teacup, QI, into a match with a reference specification, R, that's in your brain for that perception, while protecting that variable from the effects of varying disturbances, D. The idea of negative feedback, what negative feedback means, actually negative feedback is good and positive feedback turns out to be bad. Negative feedback simply means that your actions have an effect on the variable you're controlling that reduce the error, have a negative effect on the error that's driving the action itself. So negative feedback actually results in error reduction, which means that it leads to the perception staying matched with the reference signal. So negative feedback is good. Positive feedback is where the output actually increases error, which increases the output. That's what you see when somebody talks into a microphone and that goes into and that's amplified in a speaker that comes back through the microphone and is further amplified, and then you get that horrible loud screech that you hear at some concerts. The reference specifications for perceptions exist as neural signals in your brain. That's an important part of perceptual control theory, that you are the one that specifies what you should be perceiving. And these reference specifications are equivalent to the temperature setting of a home thermostat. So if you want to understand what the reference specification is in perceptual control theory, it's the same as the setting that you do for the temperature that you want your room to be when you set the temperature of a thermostat. But in perceptual control theory, the reference specifications are in your brain, so nobody else can get to them but you. You're the only one who can set the way you want your world to be. And that's an important component of perceptual control theory. So perceptual control theory gives you a very different perspective on what your brain is about than does conventional psychology. Conventional psychology, all branches really of conventional psychology, view the brain as kind of a computer-like device that transforms perception into action. But from this perspective in conventional psychology, behavior is an output. It's something that comes out of people. It's something that's emitted from people, like light from a light bulb. The PCT view of the brain is that it is a provider of specifications for the way things should be. So from a PCT perspective, the process of behavior is a process of controlling our own perceptual input relative to those specifications. So the brain your brain is a specifier of the way things should be. You are the ultimate architect of the way the world should be for you. And what you are doing from an external perspective is you're acting to make the world be the way you want it to be, to make the cup be at your lips where you want it, to make your walking happen so that you don't fall over and things like that. So that is a very different picture of what a brain is than the picture of a brain as a computer that produces output and the behavior in the case of a human, behavior is the output. So from a PCT perspective, when we're looking at people doing things, behaving, what we're seeing is people acting to control their own perceptual experience. Their behavior is the control of perception. But this way of looking at behavior turns out to help us understand why psychologists have seen behavior in so many different ways. And this little slide uses the parable of the blind men and the elephant to show what the PCT perspective on why psychology has ended up seeing behavior as a response to stimuli. That's one of the blind men is seeing behavior as a response to stimuli. And behavior is the elephant. The elephant is the control, is behavior as control of perception. So that's the reality, is that behavior is the control of perception. And one of the blind men sees this behavior as a response to stimuli. So he sees and the other blind man, looking at another aspect of the control of perception, sees it as caused by behavior as being caused by the brain, an output caused by the brain. And a third psychologist, looking at the control of perception from a third direction, sees it as selected by reinforcement. So what I want to do now is take a look at these three different ways the psychologists have looked at behavior and show you why they're all different ways of looking at the control of perception, which I call it looking at behavior, real behavior, the control of perception through PCT glasses. One of the earliest ways that psychologists looked at behavior was as a response to stimuli, and this was behaviorism that came to be in the early 1900s. And what is seen is that stimuli appear to cause responses, and the best example, or the clearest example of this kind of behavior, are the reflexes. And you're probably familiar with the pupillary reflex, which looks like a case where a light shining in the eyes is the stimulus that causes changes in the size of your pupil. So it looks like a stimulus, an external stimulus, causing a response. In fact, what's going on is a control process. You have inside your brain, there is a reference signal that specifies the desired amount of light that should be falling on your retinas, and the outside world provides a certain amount of light, the external light level, and which is varying. That's a disturbance. The external light level is a disturbance. The controlled variable, QI, is the actual amount of light that is falling on the retina, and in order to keep the light falling on the retina at the desired level, to keep the QI in a reference state, the control system has to be able to do something to compensate for the disturbance as it changes, and what it does is it varies the opening, the size of the aperture of the pupil. And so the more light there is outside, the smaller the pupil gets in order to keep the controlled variable, the level of light, the light level on the retina, at the reference level. But in doing that, from the outside, that control process looks like stimulus response. And in fact, control theory shows that any apparent stimulus response relationship, like a reflex, is a control process where you're just ignoring the control variable. For example, when a person throws a punch at your face, hope that doesn't happen much, but if somebody were to make a gesture toward your face, you would probably faint, not faint, but move back, dodge it. So it looks like a stimulus causes the response of dodging, but of course you dodge, the stimulus response relationship exists because you are controlling for keeping that fist away from your face. And so that it turns out in that situation, your reference can change. There are situations where you may want to prove yourself to be a real tough person, and so if a person takes a shot at you with their fist, you may decide that you are your reference for getting hit might be to get hit. You might not have a reference for avoiding the hit. You might have a reference for perceiving yourself get hit. And so in that case, you would not dodge the hit. You would the disturbance, it would be a disturbance if you didn't get hit. So these stimulus response relationships are actually side effects of a control process, and the central to that control process is a variable that's being controlled. And so one of the things you have to learn to look for when you see people apparently reacting to stimuli is, and we often do this, we look to see what is the variable that they are controlling by reacting that way. The second main way psychologists have looked at behavior is as an output caused by the brain. This is basically is cognitive psychology or cognitive neuropsychology now. Basically, the idea is that the behavior we see is a result of complex programming and planning that has been done in the brain, and then it rolls off in behaviors such as playing chess and doing all kind and language, speaking words and whatnot. One of my favorite examples of a behavior that's presumably caused by the brain is what's called the fixed action pattern that was discovered by ethologists back quite a ways back in the 50s, but it still happens. There is a movie on the net that I'm afraid I couldn't have the technical ability to show you, but maybe you're familiar with this. This shows, I believe they show this in many introductory psychology classes, but what we have here is a gray-lag goose who has been rolling an egg that fell out of her nest back into the nest. And the hand you see is that of, I believe, Nico Tinbergen, stealing the egg away from the goose as she's rolling it back. And the fixed action pattern refers to the fact that when the egg is removed, the goose continues to push back on the egg as if it were rolling an invisible egg, and continues to do it. And so the ethologists thought this was an example of a programmed output. They might not have been able to say that back then because computer programming hadn't become big, but or computer psychology, but they thought that if this fixed action pattern was basically a planned or programmed output that was carried out in entirety once it had been set up as a program in the brain of the hen. So this is an example of a behavior that looks like generated output, programmed output. But in fact, what's going on, at least I think, is that the goose is, and you have to look at this from the perspective of the goose, which I apparently am pretty good at, which may be a little disappointing. But anyway, when the goose is pulling the egg back into its nest, all it's perceiving is the pressure of the egg at the back of its bill. Okay, so what I believe what the goose is controlling when it pulls the egg back into its nest is the pressure of the egg on the back of its bill, and it's trying to control for a constant pressure. on the back of the bill. So the controlled variable is the actual pressure on the bill, and the disturbance to that pressure is the actual weight of the egg itself that's against the bill, and the output that maintains that pressure is the neck movement. The goose is moving, so it keeps the pressure on the egg against its bill. And inside the goose, I believe, is a reference for how much pressure it should be feeling against the back of its bill. So it's moving the egg up, continuously feeling that pressure against its bill, and then suddenly Nico comes along and takes the egg away, which reduces the pressure on the bill suddenly. And the way you compensate for that disturbance, the sudden reduction in pressure, is to push more in the direction that used to produce the pressure. And that's what I think is happening. The goose is not continuing a motor program. It is trying to get the pressure back against its bill by moving its head back in the direction that would produce pressure, but it's unfortunately unable to do that because there's no egg there. But it keeps pressing, and it will continue to do that for quite some time. And I've written simulation models that show that this is exactly what would be expected to happen. So again, an apparent behavior that looks like a cognitively planned output is actually another example of a process of control, of trying to control for the pressure on the back of the bill in this case. Finally, a third way, major way of looking at behavior is as a response that's selected by its consequences, in particular the consequence being a reward or reinforcement. And this is called operant conditioning. So there's a whole field of research devoted to understanding how the consequences of behavior select the behavior that produced those consequences. So the idea is that somehow reinforcement, a consequence of behavior, makes the behavior that produced that consequence more probable. What I think is actually going on here is, again, control of input. And actually there was a famous cartoon that joked about this. It appeared in the Harvard Crimson at the time. Skinner, who was a major advocate of operant conditioning, was in his heyday. And what it showed was two rats. One rat was pressing a bar to get reinforcement, and he's saying, "Have I got this guy conditioned? Every time I press the bar, he drops a piece of food in." In other words, it's the joke is that it's the rat that's controlling Skinner rather than Skinner controlling the rat. But in fact, I think this cartoon is very much closer to being correct than Skinner was in his ideas about what was going on. I think what's going on in reinforcement learning or reinforcement behavior, operant conditioning behavior, is that the animal, in this case a rat, pressing a bar to get food, is doing just that. The rat is pressing in order to control a variable, and the variable that I think is being controlled is the rate at which it's getting the food by pressing the bar. So the controlled variable I have here as the rate of reinforcement, and it's showing the rate of reinforcement as the rate at which food goes into the little cup that the rat is getting. Sorry, my phone is going off in the background there. The rat controls or affects this rate at which reinforcement is coming by pressing the bar at a particular rate. And finally, the the rate of there are disturbances to this rate that are sometimes introduced by the experimenter, and they're called schedules of reinforcement. In other words, those determine the number of presses that the rat has to produce in order to get the reward, the reinforcement. And so it turns out that the data show that when you make the schedule make the schedule more demanding, that is, when you require that the rat produce more presses in order to get a single reinforcement, it turns out that the rat presses more often. And it does that in order to maintain the rate at which it's getting reinforced at a constant rate. In other words, there is evidence, and there's more being collected as we speak by an excellent researcher at Duke University, who's a control theorist who I work with, Henry Yin, who's showing that indeed what's going on in operant conditioning is that the organisms are controlling their perception of the reinforcement. What's seen as reinforcement is really a controlled variable, and if you disturb this controlled variable, you can get variations in behavior in terms of the rate at which pressing occurs. So again, we see that a behavior that appears to be selected, that is an output selected by external circumstances, is actually a process of controlling perception. The point of this exercise of looking at how psychologists have looked at behavior from different points of view is to demonstrate that behavior is a process of control. You can see this when you look at behavior through what I call control theory glasses, PCT glasses, which really means looking at behavior from the perspective of the behaving system itself. And to do that, to understand what a person is doing, what their behavior is, what you want to do is try to look at it to see what variable the person might be controlling, what might be the controlled variable, what is the reference or goal state of that variable, what disturbances affect that variable, and what are the outputs that are preventing the disturbance from having much of an effect on that variable. It's something you have to learn, but it is a remarkably interesting and surprising often way of looking at the everyday behaviors that we are familiar with. I think we're at a point now where we can understand the PCT explanation of why you can be in control and controlled at the same time. You can see this using a simple demonstration that I would do if I were there in person, but I can describe to you, and you can do it in your leisure. It requires no equipment other than your hand and a partner who's cooperative. I call it a finger tracking demonstration. And what it involves is one person being the controller, the experimenter or controller. So let's say you take the role of the controller, and your partner would take the role of the subject or controllee. And what you do is you ask your partner to simply track your finger with their finger. So you would hold out your finger and ask their partners to stand facing you and move your finger along as your finger moves, to keep their finger aligned with your finger. What's happening there is that your finger movement then is a disturbance to the variable that your partner, the controllee, is controlling. If the partner cooperates, they will be controlling the distance between their finger and yours. They're trying to keep their finger close to the tip of your finger, the tip of their finger close to the tip of your finger. That's the controlled variable. And the movements of your finger as you move around in space are a disturbance to that which your partner has to correct by moving their hand appropriately. So the subject, the controllee, is controlling the distance between your finger and theirs. And you now, if you are Machiavellian enough, you now can control the controllee's finger, because you can now, because the subject is trying to maintain their finger alignment with yours, you can move their finger in any pattern you would like. And so you are in complete control of their finger position, because you are a disturbance to the variable they're controlling. So the subject, the controllee, is in control of the thing they want to control, which is the distance between their finger and yours, and you can control the thing you want to control, which is the position of the subject's finger. Okay, so you're both controlling. The subject is controlling finger distance. You are controlling the subject's hand, which he's using or she is using to control the finger distance. So this is a demonstration of control of behavior and of behavior that is controlling. You are controlling behavior, and the behavior of the subject is controlled, even though the subject is also controlling something else. This is control by manipulation, and it's not causing usually doesn't cause the subject any harm. They don't mind or even probably know they're being controlled. But if they decide that they don't like being controlled, which many people often decide, whether it's something that seems annoying or not, if a person decides being controlled, they can uncontrol themselves by simply stopping their control of the variable that was allowing them to be controlled. In other words, the subject can just say, I'm going to stop following your finger, and now you can no longer control their behavior. So your control of the other person depended on them being in control of a particular variable, which was the distance between your fingers. So this simple little demonstration demonstrates the fact that you can control behavior under certain circumstances if you can become a disturbance to a variable another person is controlling. And it also demonstrates that a person can become uncontrolled. They can remove your ability to control them if they become aware of the fact that you are controlling them, and they can just stop controlling the variable that allows you to do this. People are smart enough to be able to do this because people can see when they're being controlled. People can perceive that behavior, but other organisms can't. I think maybe primates are able to see when they're being jerked around, but that's why Skinner is able to control his pigeons and rats, and to some extent people, but so we can control people, but only up to the point where they decide they don't want to be controlled anymore. Then you get problems. which are also problems we discuss in our book, because it's true that when you do decide to control other people arbitrarily, that is, when you just decide, I want somebody else to do this, without taking into account what the other person might want, then that's a recipe for disaster. When you look at the diagram of a control system model from a PCT perspective, as we saw earlier, you can get the impression that perceptual control theory thinks of people as just one big control system. But in fact, PCT assumes that people are made up of many control systems, and in fact, the source of the reference signals for control systems are thought to be other control systems. When we've talked about PCT up to this point, we haven't talked about where or who is setting the reference signals. We did say that unlike a thermostat, you can't set another person's reference signals from outside of them. They are set in the brain. But what is it in the brain that sets those reference signals? Where do your goals or your wants for what you should perceive, where do those come from? Well, it turns out in PCT they come from higher level control systems that set those lower level goals in order to achieve their higher level goals. And so PCT is actually a model of people as a hierarchy of control systems, higher level control systems setting the specifications or reference signals for the perceptions that the lower level control systems should be controlling. And here is a sketch of the PCT hierarchy of control systems that is our theory of how complex behavior gets produced. It's a fairly complex diagram, and I just want you to get a sense of what's going on here. You obviously wouldn't be able to understand this in detail right now, but what we have here at the bottom again is the behavior we see. It's the environment of the control system. It's where the controlled variables are. It's where the actions that affect those controlled variables and the disturbances are out there. And so that's the environment is below the lowest line, and above that is our model of the brain and nervous system, rather, of the human being, of the nervous system that produces the behavior that we see. And so we see the nervous system as a set of layers, which kind of corresponds to the anatomy of the actual nervous system. We have, the spinal reflexes, and then you have the cerebellar control, and then you have the cortical levels, and so on. So there are layers of nervous system, and we believe those layers of nervous systems are layers of control systems. The lowest layer is the sensory layer, where the layer that controls things like the level of light on your retina, or the amount of the loudness of your ear, of the sound in that you're hearing. And the next level up are control systems that set the references for how much perceptions what perceptions those lower level systems should control. And the next level above that is control systems that sets the references for that second level of control systems, and so on, up and up. The names here on the right side of the slide are the names of the kinds of perceptions that we believe, in theory, are being controlled at each level. And this is all theoretical right now, although we have done some research on it, and some of it has panned out. But this is Bill Power's suggestions for the types of perceptions that are being controlled at each level of the nervous system. So the lowest level perceptions that are controlled are called our intensity perceptions, which I described as the level of light at the retina or the level of loudness on the basilar membrane. The next level up are sensation perceptions, perceptions of colors and timbres and things like that. The next level up is transitions, movements, changes in sensations. And the next level up, we are perceptions of configurations, the objects in the world that we see, the windows and TV screens and whatever. The next level up is relationships between these lower level perceptions, so the variables controlled at that level are relationships, like whether something is on something or next to, whether we want the glass to be under the desk or above it. And the next level up are sequences, are variable. These would be sequences of words or phonemes or whatnot. And the next level up are events, like the variables there are the type of golf swing you do, or how you do a tennis swing, or how you produce a complete event. Next level up are programs, like carrying out doing a recipe. The next level up is controlling for principles, like honesty is the best policy, and so the highest level, and there is a top to this hierarchy, the highest level perceptions right now are conceived to be what we call system concepts, like how you want the world to be, what kind of society you want to perceive yourself living in. So this is the model of you. You are a hierarchy of control systems controlling all at the same time different types of perceptions, and actually you are controlling the lower level perceptions as the means of controlling for those higher levels perceptions. So the references for transitions are set in order to perceive certain kinds of relationships or sequences and so on. So it's a very complex model, but we have shown that it can work. You can build a hierarchy of control systems that will control several levels of variables with several control systems at each level, and it all works out just fine. It's rather amazing. But anyway, that is the control system, the PCT model. I guess one of the things that's interesting about this is that the model is autonomous in the sense that the model is you, and the model says that it's you, the behaving system, that sets its own references, its own goals. You set your own goals autonomously. Nothing outside affects that. But those goals are set in the context of achieving higher level goals. So you're not completely free to set your goals. So there's autonomy, but not complete freedom, whatever that is, in this system. In other words, you can't put your hand anywhere you like if your higher level goal is to catch a ball, and so on. So. And the other thing that's important about this idea is that this hierarchy has a top. And so nothing sets the highest level goals. There's nothing that constrains how. So so in a sense, those highest level goals constrain how you set all your lower level goals. So that would suggest that what you come up with as your highest level goals, your system concepts, will have a lot to do with the kind of behavior you produce, the kind of person you are. How people develop their highest level goals is really not very well known, but I will show you in a second one hypothesis about how it happens. But this is a model that is autonomous. It is not completely free, but it is. But this is a model that shows that you are a healthy person. Not if you are so much if you're free or anything, but if you are in control. This model is healthy to the extent that all the perceptions it is controlling at all these different levels of the hierarchy are being kept under control. To the extent that they're not, then there will be error signals, and we believe that those error signals are perceived as emotions and stress, anxiety, depression, and whatnot, if the error is chronic. When you're in control, if everything is under control in your life, which means if all of the perceptions in this hierarchy are matching the reference specifications, then there is virtually no error in the system, and you're feeling not so much happy or sad, but just that's probably what nirvana is like. You're in nirvana. One of the other paradoxes we deal with in our book, Controlling People, is actually one of the main paradoxes that we mention, and that is the fact that because we are controlling people, because our job is to keep our perceptions under control, our controlling nature can often be the reason why we lose control. That's a paradox. And it's actually a problem. That's the essential problem, really, of being a controlling person, is that our own requirement that we keep things under control can often lead to us losing control. And that happens when two control systems end up controlling for perceptions that require another perception to be in two different states at the same time. And I made a little diagram of an example. This is called conflict. So we lose control when control systems are in conflict. And control systems are in conflict when they're trying to control the wrong things, in a sense. Things that lead to them not being able to achieve the goals of each system. Here's a conflict that actually happened to my co-author, not to him, but to one of his clients. Had a conflict that eventually they were able to see that it was a conflict between controlling for getting financial gain and being able to cooperate with their partner. The person came in because they were in tremendous stress because their partner, I don't believe it was their wife, but let's say it was the wife, was causing them problems because he wanted to sell the place they were living and make some money off it because the market was good. And the partner didn't want to sell and wanted to stay in the apartment or the condominium that he wanted to sell. So he had a conflict. So he wanted to make money. He wanted financial gain from selling the apartment, but he also wanted to cooperate with his partner. And it turns out that you can't do both. He couldn't do both. He couldn't, because in order to make the financial gain, he had to sell the house or condominium, and in order to cooperate with his partner, he had to not sell. So selling was the variable in conflict. To achieve his goal, he wanted to he had to sell, and in order for to cooperate with his partner, he had to not sell. And you can't do both. You can't sell and not sell. It's just not something that can be done. So that was the conflict. And what that means is he was not able to achieve either of the goals he had. He was not able to bring the perception of financial gain to the reference, and he was not able to bring his cooperation with his partner to the reference. And so he was experiencing error in both of those control systems, and that's why he came into therapy. But what we have here is a case where, because he wanted to be in control of two different things, it happened to be that the two different things he wanted to be in control of required incompatible means of achieving those goals. There's nothing wrong with either goal. There's nothing wrong with wanting to make money, and there's nothing wrong with cooperating with your partner. So he was controlling for perfectly legitimate things. It just turned out that it was impossible to control for those things simultaneously in the world he was living in, a world where he only had one condominium to sell and one condominium to live in with his partner. So conflict is the enemy of control, and it's also created by control. Only control systems get into conflict. There's no conflict if the entities involved in the disagreement are not control systems, because they don't want anything to be any particular way. When two rocks roll down against each other from different sides of the hill, one doesn't start pressing harder to get down to the other side, or the other one doesn't press against it. They just hit against each other and stay there, and they're just there. But when control systems come into conflict, they keep pushing harder and harder, and it feels bad. There are two different kinds of conflicts: intrapersonal, which is a conflict between control systems within a person, and interpersonal, which are conflicts between two different people. But in both cases, they're conflicts between control systems. In one case, the control systems are in one person, and in the other, the control systems are in two or more different people. Conflict is almost inevitable when many control systems are controlling at the same time in the same place. There's just not enough degrees of freedom, we call it, in the world. There's not enough free variables available in the world to make it impossible to avoid conflict completely. So we're always getting into conflicts. We always experience conflicts. We always have little conflicts coming up. You've surely experienced them. Sometimes I am clearing the table and I want to bring something into the kitchen, and I'm holding something that goes to the kitchen and another thing that goes into the hutch, which is in the dining room. So I pick them up and I'm suddenly frozen because I want to move to the kitchen and I also want to move to the hutch, and so I don't move in either direction. And so there's a conflict. But, those conflicts don't last long. Why, I don't know, but basically what you do is you just flip a coin in your head, basically, and do one thing or another, or you do one thing after another. That's one of the common ways of solving these little conflicts that come up, intrapersonal conflicts anyway, is to do one thing first and then the other. And so that's seeing from a higher level that you can do that. But sometimes these conflicts persist, especially when they're conflicts about very complicated high-order perceptions. And when these conflicts persist, as I said in the example before, you've got persistent error, persistent discrepancy between what you want, what your reference for what you should be perceiving is, and what you're getting. And error creates emotion, probably because error is driving output. Error is connected to your muscular system and all that, and as the greater the error, the more output is wanted, basically, by the control system, and so that leads to the production, probably, of adrenaline, acetylcholine. I don't know these chemistry, but as if you're persistently driving a muscle tissue, and it's getting nowhere, the muscle tissue is not accomplishing anything, you're going to be secreting a lot of these chemicals, which are known to be when there's an excess of these chemicals in your body, you experience that as an emotion, which was demonstrated by in the famous Schachter experiments, where he actually injected some people with adrenaline, and they had an emotion as a result, and interpreted it in terms of what another person was seemed to be feeling. So persistent conflict results in persistent error, which results in emotion, which is experienced as stress, anxiety, depression, fear, and it's not fun. It's not good to have. I should say, especially given my current situation, that there are other causes of persistent error besides conflict for control systems. Conflict is the major treatable cause of error, persistent error, and therefore psychological distress. But there's also other causes, and one of the main causes that's not psychological cause, really, is what we call insuperable disturbance. Death of a loved one, sickness in a loved one, a hurricane rips down your house, natural disasters. These are things that make what you are perceiving be nothing like what you want it to be like. And it creates a large error, and it creates a persistent error. Death of a loved one, you can't correct that right away. You can't correct it ever. So you have to learn to live with these things, and so that is another cause of chronic error. But that is not the kind that is necessarily. It takes a different kind of therapy to work on that one. The main kind of psychological problem that we talk about in controlling people is conflict, because that's a psychological problem that you cause for yourself, that we cause for ourselves, because we are control systems, because we control. And so we don't do it because we're bad or stupid or whatever. We do it because we are controlling, and so we have to learn to live with this controlling nature. But we do eventually solve conflicts. We solve the little ones immediately, and people do eventually solve the big conflicts, or at least they often do. And and what that means, and from a PCT perspective, is that they get their hierarchy of control systems controlling properly again. how does this happen? Well, we have to put in now the final piece of the PCT puzzle. We know that people don't come into the world already with their control systems all built and controlling just fine. People have to learn to control, and even once they've learned to control, they have to maintain their control systems and keep them up to par, keep them working properly. And so what PCT posits that there's this thing called a reorganization system. It's a part of the nervous system, probably, but we don't know. But it sits outside of the hierarchy of control that's actually producing our behavior, control of perception behavior. So it's outside of the hierarchy, and what it is, it's like this. This is the ghost in the machine. This is the aspect of you that is tuning up or learning how to control, it's tuning up existing control systems or building new ones that are needed to control in new ways. And it does this, so the reorganizing system comes into play when there is error, when either control systems don't exist to control for something that should be controlled for, or that aren't controlling properly. An error produces what is called an intrinsic error. It creates an emotion. All these physiological effects of error affect what we call your intrinsic state, your physiological state, and that wakes up the reorganizing system. And the reorganizing system is basically a system that tweaks randomly, excuse me, the control systems in the hierarchy, and because it doesn't know how to fix things. If it were smart enough to know how to fix it, it would just fix it. But it randomly tweaks the control systems in the hierarchy, and this random tweaking slows down when things start getting better and speeds up again if things start getting worse. So it's called a biased random walk process, and it works quite effectively. We've simulated this, and it's actually a surprisingly effective way of correcting poor controlling. So, excuse me, it's the reorganizing system that is ultimately responsible for fixing chronic error and fixing up conflicts. Real conflict cannot be solved in the way you solve math problems. You can't, there's no clever way to solve conflicts by, you can find compromises for conflict and whatnot, but ultimately compromises, they're nice, but all they do is they kind of reduce error maybe in one or the other of the control systems involved, but they don't solve a conflict in the sense that they don't eliminate the error in the systems that are conflicted. I guess I'm going to have to do this. Excuse me. It's the reorganizing system that actually has to come into operation in order to solve the conflicts. And these solutions usually involve changing the way higher level systems set the references for lower level systems. It's the way the solution to conflict is a change in the way you want or the way your references work. And that's a very fundamental change in the way the control systems work. And that kind of change is the kind of change that has to come from the reorganization system. So you can't solve conflict by, at least in theory, by control theory, you can't solve these conflicts simply by being clever. You have to let the reorganization system do its work. And so that's pretty much I've now discussed all of the whole theory, at least qualitatively, and this is what we handle. This is what we discuss in our book, Controlling People. And I think we do it in a fairly readily comprehensible way, but it took me I'd say at least 5 years to get a pretty good grasp of really what perceptual control theory was about and how it applied in reality to people. It's it takes some work, and I was studying this all the time. It was the basis of all my research. So it's but you can get I think you can get a good basic idea of what perceptual control theory is about from our book. But here are some other sites you can go to get more information. And in particular, you can go to my site, mindreadings.com. I call it that because I've got 2 books that are called Mind Readings, and the idea is that they're readings. They're actually fairly technical papers, but they're a set of readings about how the mind works, which is what PCT is about. And actually the term mind reading comes from one of my demos, which I call the mind reading demo because it demonstrates a way to determine what a person's intentions or purposes are when you can't tell what they're doing by just looking at their behavior. But anyway, that mind reading site has some actual hands-on demonstrations that you can do that might help you understand the basic idea of perceptual control theory. And these other sites have lots of readings and materials about it that will help you. So thank you for paying attention, if you did. And I look forward to talking to you by internet at one of your workshops later in the conference.